Welcome. This is exciting. My name is David Wiss. I'm a registered dietitian and the founder of Nutrition and Recovery here in Los Angeles. Today I'm going to review a paper that we wrote called Preclinical Evidence for the Addiction Potential of Highly Palatable Foods, Current Developments Related to Maternal Influence. And this was published in the Appetite Journal. Preclinical means animal models. So essentially this review is focused on the animal evidence related to the link between what the mother eats during pregnancy and the neurodevelopment of the offspring. The backdrop for this article is the quote-unquote obesity epidemic, which I do realize is very controversial, not necessarily looking at it as an attempt to make a war on obesity, but more looking at it from a public health perspective and considering what are some of the upstream risk factors for increasing weight in humans. There's a lot of contributing mechanisms, and part of what we're going to talk about today is the generational effects through mother to offspring. We know that the current food environment encourages excessive consumption of highly palatable foods, and this can cause neuroadaptations in the mesolimbic dopamine reward pathways, very similar to drug addiction. Pediatric obesity is a growing problem, and the question that we're going to attempt to answer is, what about prenatal and intrauterine nutrition? How can this affect appetite regulation in the offspring? Just an overview about the hypothalamus. This is an important part of the brain. There's something called the arcuate nucleus, which we know is the integration site in the hypothalamus. It takes all the appetite-related signals from the blood and communicated from the gut, different hormones, etc., and it brings it all together to influence eating behavior. So the metabolic state influences the reward system by linking the hypothalamus with the reward pathways in the brain. So we know that the rise in obesity rates are in part, just in part, explained by early life nutritional imbalances. It's important to understand that hormones talk to the brain, particularly insulin, leptin, and ghrelin. They all have a role in calibrating the reward that's modulated by the dopamine system. Leptin also modulates dopamine circuits to generate a behavioral response. We have evidence that altering leptin impacts the brain, and different dietary interventions alter leptin. So it's all linked, and the question is, how do we bring it all together? Ghrelin also is involved in hedonic eating and alters dopamine neurons in the VTA, that's the ventral tegmental area of the brain. So neurodevelopment in utero is influenced by maternal feeding patterns via perturbations in insulin, leptin, and ghrelin signaling. These hormones interact with the development of the reward system, particularly in the VTA, impacting the homeostatic and hedonic mechanisms that govern feeding behavior. Nutritional imbalances during pregnancy have the potential to stimulate reward-based eating in the offspring. It's important to understand that while we're mostly talking about overnutrition today, there's a lot of data in humans to suggest that undernutrition has intergenerational effects as well. Offspring come into the world with a predictive adaptive response, perhaps some thrifty genes expecting to come into a world of starvation, but they end up in a world of abundance, which has also been linked to chronic conditions like diabetes, coronary heart disease, etc. But overfeeding is what we're looking at in our animal models. This has the potential to cause metabolic imprinting, can reduce energy expenditure, put people at higher risk for metabolic disorders, and the evidence implicates both the dopamine and the opioid systems. It's also important to acknowledge that lactation, which is about 3 weeks in our animal model, also influences neurodevelopment. A higher palatable diet can lead to a higher concentration of hypothalamic dopamine. So both fetal under and overnutrition have potential to impact the appetite regulating neural network in the hypothalamus, implicating both the dopamine and opioid systems in the intergenerational risk for obesity and other metabolic disorders. Additionally, the early postnatal period influenced by the quality of milk during lactation, has also been shown to create neuroendocrine imbalances, which can lead to delayed feelings of satiety and hyperphagia in the offspring. So intrauterine programming is our topic today. We're looking at how maternal exposure to highly palatable foods can have an impact on reward processing that moves well into adulthood. And this is just important because if you think about it, we're now in this quote-unquote opioid epidemic. The addiction crisis has gotten worse, and we haven't really thought much about what a mother eats during pregnancy and how can that be a predisposing risk factor for the development of addiction like brain chemistry. Of course, we know that social and environmental factors are important, but this is a physiological basis which puts people at higher risk for addiction-like behavior. And one example would be increased impulsivity, which can also be linked to dopamine receptor function. So with intrauterine programming, when there's changes in food, there's changes in hormones, and these changes in hormones interact with the dopamine system. We also know that low maternal protein during pregnancy can lead to offspring that have a higher preference for foods that are rich in sugar, salt, and fat. There's similarities between eating behavior and drug-seeking behavior. This is the big unanswered question at this point. Does food exposure during critical periods of neurodevelopment impact consumption behavior for drugs? Genetics is an important part of this puzzle. It's not just genetics, but epigenetics now that we understand. Our animal evidence suggests that nutritional insults during pregnancy can be passed to second and third generations. And this is by way of methylation process. Drugs of abuse can cause methylation to be either overmethylated, hypermethylation, or hypomethylated, all of which modify gene expression. And this is a very rich area of current research and investigation. So early life nutritional programming can have a lasting impact on behavior via the reward system, including the dopamine transporter and more, which is the mu opioid receptor. Elevated blood levels of insulin and leptin in the offspring of overfed mothers can lead to states of resistance and subsequent weight gain. Hormonal influence on dopamine neurons may lead to symptoms of addiction-like eating, so that's impulsivity, attentional bias, and incentive salience, for example. And furthermore, epigenetic modifications stemming from nutritional insults during pregnancy have the potential to become transgenerational. Changes in DNA methylation appear to modify genetic expression of DAT and more, pre-programming the rewarding properties of highly palatable foods. So to bring this all together, what we've looked at today is this idea of addiction transfer from mother to offspring via dysregulation of reward systems that begin to develop in utero. And so how can we link maternal ingestion of foods that are addiction-like to neurodevelopment of the offspring, which impacts ingestive behavior of both foods and drugs of abuse? It's also important to acknowledge that the timing of the nutritional insult is important. The most sensitive time windows are gestation and lactation, and it appears that the closer towards the birth matters, although there are other periods of development that seem to matter, and we certainly need to know more. But the point is, junk food during pregnancy can have lasting effects that persist into adulthood. So in conclusion, neuroadaptations within reward-related centers of the brain contribute to hedonic hyperphagia. That's excess eating of highly palatable foods. Given what we know about food addiction, it's likely that a mother who consumes junk food during gestation will likely do so during lactation. And then after the offspring is born, this can create a compositive effect, which is an interaction between genetic vulnerability, social and environmental vulnerability as well. Having a greater understanding of addiction transfer will help us to develop effective interventions to combat the obesity pandemic. Monitoring dietary intake during pregnancy can become an important preventative measure. Macronutrients should be balanced, and we need to think about reducing exposure to highly palatable foods. I know this was heavy and certainly going after food industry and quote unquote junk food. It's a sensitive topic and not a lot of people are willing to go there, but I am. I think it's an important topic, and if you have comments or questions about it, I'd love to engage with you. Thanks for listening.